All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the New England Hemophilia Association's Webinar Wednesday series. My name is Rich Pizzillo. I'm NEHA's Executive Director. This fall, NEHA was so excited to once again partner with the Boston University's Master Program in Genetic Counseling to host a graduate intern this fall. Tonight, you will be hearing from our fall intern, Julia, who is from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and spent her undergraduate years at Drake University studying biochemistry, cell and molecular biology, and psychology. She has a particular interest in the rare disease space, and in her free time, she loves to cook, practice yoga, and be outside by the Charles River. That's her bio that she gave to us when we announced her internship on social media. I just want to say personally, it's been an absolute joy working with Julia over the past several weeks. I believe this is now our fourth intern that we've had with the Boston University Master's Program, and she's been an absolute delight. First one to always offer to help us out with anything that is needed. Tonight's webinar that Julia will be hosting is a special interactive session that will provide a history of genetic counseling, to share thoughts of provoking cases and explain how genetic counseling can help those in the bleeding disorder community. So before we get started, I just want to go over a few webinar pointers. I think at this point, most of us are experts in terms of how to maneuver Zoom, but we are recording this presentation. The way it does record, it will just show those that are in the speaker mode, so Julia and myself. So if your camera is on, do not worry, you will not be recorded. We are going to be putting this on our YouTube channel so that those that can attend tonight can also watch this. This webinar will last for approximately 1 hour. And of course, we welcome your presentation and feedback. So if you have questions for Julia, please put them in the chat and she will take all questions at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I am super excited to now turn the baton over to Julia. Julia, tell you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Rich. It's been lovely to work with NEHA, and it's been really exciting. This is my first time working with a nonprofit, so it's been really awesome, and I'm excited to give this webinar tonight. So we wanted to start off really quickly with a live poll, but just in the chat. So if you could type in the chat, if you feel like you could describe a genetic counselor, or if you've never met one before, or if you know nothing about genetic counseling, just kind of your experience with a genetic counselor or genetic counseling, so that I can get a sense of where we're going with the webinar and what you might want to get out of it.
So we have moderate knowledge of what you do. Riley has friends who are genetic counselors. There's some training to be a genetic counselor.
Great. It looks like we kind of have a widespread of people that have a kind of a solid grasp on genetic counseling, and a couple people who would be very interested to learn more. We have a couple of genetic counselors on the call, including my faculty or my program director and other students. And people are interested to learn how genetic counseling interacts with the bleeding disorder community, which is what this is all about. So I will go ahead and share my screen and get started. All right, so as Rich said, my name is Julia. I use she, her pronouns, and I am I'm a second-year graduate student at the Boston University Genetic Counseling Program and NEHA's intern for the next couple weeks. So I wanted to begin with an agenda, just kind of outlining what this presentation will and won't cover. So first, we're going to talk about some terms to know related to genetic counseling. Since genetics can be kind of lofty and complicated, I wanted to be sure that we're breaking down things. And if I do say a term and you don't know what it is and I don't explain it, feel free to drop that in the chat, and I will try to make sure that I answer those questions as they come up, but we can also talk about them at the end. Then I'll go into a little bit about what genetic counseling is. We'll do a brief genetics review, kind of touching on some concepts that might have been learned in high school biology. Then we'll talk about genetic counseling for bleeding disorders, and I'll do some case examples of prenatal cases and preconception cases. All right, so one of the most frequently used terms in genetics is chromosome, and I wanted to break this down. This right here is called a karyotype. It's a picture of your chromosomes. So when we think about the word chromosome, we think about the word DNA. Those are very closely related. A chromosome is just this condensed form of DNA. In this picture, you see all of the chromosomes, which represents all of the DNA that somebody has. People typically have 23 pairs of chromosomes. One set comes from the egg and one set comes from the sperm. I may use the word autosome in this presentation, which just means these chromosomes numbered 1 through 22 that are not X and Y. X and Y are the sex chromosomes. So autosome means that it's not a sex chromosome. For the sake of teaching this material, I will exclusively use examples with 2 sex chromosomes per person, where the person's sex assigned at birth and gender are the same. This is for the sake of teaching and simplicity. This is not true. There is variation in the population for sex chromosomes and gender, and sex chromosomes are just one of many markers that impact somebody's sex. Also, I'd like to note that sex chromosomes do not determine gender, which is why I give this caveat. Some other terms that are important is genetic condition. This is really broad. It's any condition affected in some way by someone's genes, by a change in anyone's genes. I'll talk about what genes are in just a moment. Inherited means that it's passed down from parent to child, so you can have a genetic condition that's not passed down from parent to child, but I'll mostly be talking about inherited bleeding disorders in this talk. A phenotype is when someone has observable features of a condition. So if somebody has a bleeding disorder, part of their phenotype would be these spontaneous bleeds that happen in the joints. A pedigree is what you see to the side over here. It's basically a snapshot picture of a family tree or a visual representation when we're taking a family history. The shapes on the family tree represent gender. So here this would be a man with a square and then a woman with a circle. Usually we denote a pregnancy as a diamond with a P on the inside. These lines represent different relationships. So here this man is married to this woman and these are their children. The filled in square represents that this person is affected by a genetic condition. So when we see these like blank, unfilled in shapes, we're thinking somebody is unaffected. And when we see them filled in, we're thinking somebody is affected. So these are different inheritance patterns. Like I said, inheritance is when something is passed down from a parent to a child. They're important to know because we'll talk about different inheritance patterns related to the different bleeding disorders. So when we're thinking about genes, which are a unit of inheritance, again, that I'll go over in my genetics review, but each gene has a different inheritance pattern. So there are some genes where only one of your copies needs to be affected for you to have the condition, and these are called dominant conditions or dominant genes. There are also other different genes where you need to have both copies affected for you to have the condition. This would be a recessive condition. You can see here that if this is a set of somebody's chromosomes, say this is chromosome number 1, everybody has 2 sets of chromosome number 1, and this gene would be on both chromosomes. So you would need to see basically all copies of somebody's genes to be affected with a recessive condition. To be a carrier is related only to recessive and X-linked conditions, which we'll get to in a minute. But somebody who is a carrier has only one variant on a gene, and it does not confer the diagnosis of a genetic condition. It only confers carrier status. Sometimes we see carriers that have a phenotype, but most of the time carriers are unaffected. So, what is genetic counseling? We went over this a little bit. It sounds like a couple people have a good grasp, but I'd love if you could drop in the chat any words that remind you of genetic counseling or things that you think are associated with genetic counseling. And I'm realizing I can't see the chat. So Rich, if you could let me know if anybody drops anything in there.
Absolutely. You have teacher.
Yes, definitely. We do a lot of education, especially since genetics can be so complicated.
We have advocate.
Yes, this is following along well with my definition of a genetic counselor. We definitely are advocates for our patients. We're part of a healthcare team. I see more responses coming in.
We have explain the complex stuff. Genetic counselor, empathy, researcher.
Yes. Okay, so I love that we're getting a variety of answers because genetic counselors can do a lot, and genetic counseling is very versatile. There's lots of things that happen in genetic counseling. So, a genetic counseling is a process to evaluate and understand a family's risk of an inherited medical condition. So, we're thinking something that's passed down and related to your genes. A genetic counselor is a healthcare professional with specialized training in both medical genetics and counseling. So sometimes doctors will have medical genetics training, but it's nice to either be working with a geneticist who is a medical doctor who's specialized in genetics, or a genetic counselor when you're ordering genetic testing on a healthcare team, because we do have this specialized knowledge. We trained for 2 years in medical genetics, and we're also able to provide counseling, psychosocial skills. So genetic counselors do a lot. Like I was just saying, genetics can be complicated. One of our roles is to break down these concepts and ensure that our patients are understanding what's happening. A genetic counselor also takes a personal and family history to provide a risk assessment and better understand what the patient already has going on. We can explain the benefits and limitations of genetic testing and ensure that the appropriate testing is ordered. We can also talk through the results of genetic testing and help you make decisions about your genetic health. And along with these counseling skills, we can provide emotional support and be an advocate for our patients. So, where do genetic counselors work? Everywhere is a good answer. Most genetic counselors work in a clinic or a hospital, but there are also roles in research, in industry, in education, in the lab, and we work as an interdisciplinary team. So we're often working alongside doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals to coordinate care for our patients. Historically, there were 3 genetic counseling specialties, the big 3, I like to think of them as. It's pediatrics, prenatal, and cancer. However, there are a multitude of specialties that you can go into as a genetic counselor, including special system approaches like cardio genetic counseling that focuses on the heart, or neurology that focuses on the brain. So, genetic counseling for bleeding disorders. Let's dive in. Genetic counselors meet with people who have bleeding disorders or a family history of a bleeding disorder all the time. These are the inherited bleeding disorders that we'll cover today, including hemophilia A and B, von Willebrand disease, and I wanted to mention that there are other factor deficiencies since these 2 conditions they have factor deficiencies as well, but I won't be going into detail since these conditions are very rare. This consult for a genetic counselor seeing somebody with a bleeding disorder is often in a prenatal or preconception setting, but could also be in a pediatric setting, since some bleeding disorders are very mild and you may not see symptoms until the child is older. All right, let's dive in. Genetics review. So I like an analogy, which is what I will use here. I'm going to use the instruction manual analogy. So if DNA is all the material that makes up who we are, we're thinking of DNA as the complete instruction manual for our bodies. Within that DNA, chromosomes are chapters, so they're not a different book, they're just sections of the book. Genes would be the sentences. They make sense on their own, but they do a lot in coordination with the other sentences to complete this instruction manual's functions. The actual functioning units of the DNA are proteins, which carry out different things in the body. For example, the F8 gene, which is associated with hemophilia, codes for the F8 protein, which helps with clotting. So I wanted to point to this up here, which is saying that mutation, I will be using the word variant, but if the word mutation rings a bell in your head, I want you to think of that. So if we're thinking about our instruction manual and the sentences in it, what happens if we have a variant in those sentences? This can cause a genetic condition. So we can think of it, there are different types of mutations, including something like a typo, where instead of red, the word reads RDD. There's also insertions and deletions where whole words can be deleted, aka larger parts of a gene, where instead of the car was red, it might read the was red. There are other different mutations that can happen, and these variants can, I won't go into detail in these variants, but if you are curious, you can read this slide or we can talk about it afterward. I also wanted to mention here what genetic testing is. I think we talk about genetic testing all the time and rarely break down what would happen to me if I were to get genetic testing. So genetic testing can be done a few different ways. It can be done with a blood sample, a saliva sample, or even just a cheek cell swab. Then it's sent off to the lab, and the lab analyzes the DNA code, the part of the DNA code that we want to know about, and it looks for these typos or these insertions or deletions. There are different turnaround times for each test. The quickest I've seen is a couple days where you get a stat test, and the longest can be when we read all of the book, and that takes months. So for hemophilia A and B, these are clinically indistinguishable, but they're both conditions where you have not enough clotting or too much bleeding. You can think of those as synonymous. In hemophilia A and B, these are X-linked recessive conditions. So X-linked, we're thinking about the X chromosome, which is one of the sex chromosomes. It's one of the most gene-dense chromosomes in the whole body. And when we're thinking about conditions that are impacted by the status of the X chromosome, we also think about what chromosome somebody has to maybe be a backup or not be a backup. So another X chromosome can act as a backup for an X chromosome that has a variant in an X-linked recessive condition, because they would technically be considered a carrier. Recessive, as you'll remember, means that you need 2 copies of the gene to be affected to have a diagnosis. Now, this is where the interesting part comes in. If you have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, Y isn't a backup. Even though it is a sex chromosome, it's very different from the X chromosome. So when we're thinking about an X-linked recessive condition, if somebody with an X and a Y pairing has a variant on the X chromosome, they will be fully affected with that condition. Even though it's called recessive, they don't need 2 copies of that X to be affected. Whereas if we're seeing an X with a backup X, then that person is just a carrier and will not be affected by the condition in the same way that somebody did not have a backup would be. Again, this caveat is important to point out that sex chromosomes are just one of many markers that impact someone's sex. For the majority of the presentation, I'll be referring to XX as female and XY as male. And let me know if you have any questions about that at the end. So, X-linked recessive, what does that mean? So if this man is affected, he has 1 X chromosome and 1 Y chromosome. If his partner is unaffected and they have children, then we're thinking about him passing the Y on to anybody that would be affected if he passed on his X, but he's passing on his Y. So these people would be unaffected. All of his sons would be unaffected. All of his daughters, however, would be affected because he's giving them the X that has a variant on it. So we see carrier daughters because the mother is unaffected. Over here, if we switch the scenario, and the dad is unaffected, and we have a carrier as his partner, then there is more variation. Then if mom passes on her X to this person who has a Y and no backup, they will be affected. But if she passes on her X with a variant to this person who gets a backup X, then they are a carrier. It's important to note that in hemophilia, some female carriers have symptoms, about 10%. So hemophilia A, I've been talking about hemophilia A and hemophilia B, but I'll start with A. This is caused by a mutation in the factor VIII gene. There's a a spectrum of severity in this condition, and in the most severe form, 50% have an intron 22A inversion. What does that mean? Here's a picture. So this third row represents an inversion. This is talking about when a chromosome, which is typically a linear structure, makes a loop around itself and winds up in a backwards order. So in this severe form, the chromosome structurally looks different than we would expect. In the mild to moderate form, there are other types of variants that happen, and they're not this big switch around, or they're not usually this big switch around. They're more likely to be these kind of cutting out of words or addition of words, if we're using the book analogy. In hemophilia B, this is caused by a mutation in the factor IX gene. It's a bit rarer than hemophilia A, and people with hemophilia B are actually less likely to form an inhibitor, which I'll talk about in our treatment slide. Here in hemophilia B, it's typically a point mutation where instead of the word reading RED, it reads RDD. So just kind of a typo, a spelling difference. It's important to note that hemophilia A and B have indistinguishable clinical features, but they are caused by different genetic variants, and that's why it would be important to get genetic testing so we could better understand the course and the treatment for that patient. Typically in hemophilia, when we're talking about the phenotype, we see bleeding in the joints. It can be caused by nothing at all. That would be a spontaneous bleed, or it could be caused by injury or something as small as dental work. So I just mentioned that carriers that usually have a backup, X, might have symptoms. Does anybody know why this might be? If not, that's all right. It's kind of a complicated question.
Can I take a stab, Julia?
Yes, Rich, please.
Is it because carriers are women, which are XX, and they carry the hemophilia gene on one of those X's, so they don't have a Y to balance it out?
So it can, yeah, it's definitely related to their sex chromosomes. So when we're thinking about having two X's, we think about this concept called skewed X chromosome inactivation. So I mentioned that the X chromosome is very gene rich, which means it has a lot of information. Your body can do a lot of functions because it has an X chromosome. So X chromosome inactivation is where the cell randomly turns off one of your X chromosomes. Of the billions of cells in your body, this happened randomly in each one. So if we look at the picture over here and think about the red X as being affected and the blue X as being unaffected, if your body kind of gets a half and half random ratio sampling correctly, then that person would be a carrier with very few symptoms. However, if the body randomly turns off a lot of the blue unaffected X and we're left with a lot of the red affected X turned on, then we may see somebody with more symptoms, looking more like somebody that may not have a backup X chromosome. Like I mentioned, about 10% of carriers have symptoms, and in our case example, we'll go over what some of these symptoms might be. Another question. Some individuals are the first in their family to have hemophilia, so how is this possible? Like I mentioned before, it's possible to have a spontaneous mutation for a genetic condition that's not inherited from parent to child. So about 30% of cases of hemophilia arise from a spontaneous mutation, which means that early on in development, probably right near conception, the DNA is copying itself over and over billions of times to make all the cells that make up you. In that case, there was an error early on that caused this genetic variant that then replicated itself over and over, causing the person to have the condition. There's also a hypothesis called mosaicism or gonadal mosaicism, where we can think about the parents' gametes kind of making the same error in development when they were developing. So the parent would be themselves unaffected, but some of their egg or sperm cells could be carrying a mutation. When we think about mosaicism, we think about the impossibility of testing this hypothesis, which is why I call it a hypothesis, because there's no way to test all of the gametes that somebody is carrying. So switching gears just a little bit, von Willebrand disease. This is another inherited bleeding disorder, and it's actually the most common inherited bleeding disorder in the world. It's located on chromosome 12, the VWF gene, which stands for von Willebrand factor. So we're thinking about factor 8 and factor 9 in hemophilia A and B, and here we're thinking about the actual name of the condition, von Willebrand factor. These factors are all important in the clotting cascade, which is basically a domino effect of what happens when you are cut or are bleeding in some way, is the domino clotting cascade kind of falls down on top of each other to form a clot and stop the bleed. Since part of the clotting cascade is not working in these conditions, then they have problems clotting. Here in von Willebrand disease, we're also thinking about point mutations, which would be, again, that spelling change from RED to RDD. The inheritance pattern here is a little bit different. There are two separate inheritance patterns that can happen, and actually either inheritance pattern can happen in the second form of VWD. When we're thinking of a dominant condition, here we're representing the affected gene with a capital B. So if the capital B affected gene gets passed on, anybody who gets that gene will be affected, regardless of sex. In a recessive condition, we're thinking about the little a representing the affected, and the little a's would both have to be passed on. So if you have two carriers of a recessive condition, these people may have no symptoms, but they do have a chance, a 25% chance of having an affected child. Here, if one partner has a dominant condition themselves and their partner does not have the dominant condition, there's a 50% chance for their offspring to be affected and a 50% chance for them to be unaffected. Like I mentioned, and similar to hemophilia, there are different types of von Willebrand disease. So type 1 is the most common and the mildest, typically presenting later in life and with less severe bleeding. So this may be a surprise when you get your wisdom teeth out or something like that. But it may be running in families because it is dominant, which means that 50% of the, there's a 50% chance that you'll have affected offspring. Type 2 is kind of the middle. There are multiple subtypes and multiple inheritance patterns. So it's a little bit jumbled. I won't go into it, but the factor is not working well, is working better than the severe form, but not as well as the mildest form. Finally, type 3 is the most severe form, where you have no von Willebrand factor, which actually affects factor 8 because they're related in the clotting cascade. In this form, it is recessive, meaning you need both copies of the gene to be affected, but we only see this in 5 to 10% of the population. So treatments, what can be done? So it's common to do factor infusions because I keep mentioning this word factor. Basically, one of the dominoes in the clotting cascade is a factor in the cascade, if you will. So factor infusions is how we do this. It's a supplement to your body of the factor that it isn't making itself. And this can happen prophylactically or on demand, meaning it can happen frequently, either weekly, daily. Each treatment regimen is different to the patient, or it can happen on demand. So when you are experiencing a bleed, that would be when you do factor. Different for everybody, also depends on the type of bleeding disorder you have and on the type of severity. So this inhibitor that I mentioned previously for hemophilia, we can think of the inhibitor as Pac-Man. He eats the clotting factor. So we're giving factor infusions, but the inhibitor is like, no, I don't want you to have that factor, and doesn't let your body use it. It basically eats it or makes it inactive. So if this happens, it can be a large barrier to treatment, and the process to treat that patient can be really difficult. It can be hard on the family, especially since this is the main treatment that's used for hemophilia. To develop an inhibitor is a very difficult thing for that patient and for that patient's family. It can also be very expensive to try to retreat someone who has developed an inhibitor. You can also see these non-factor replacements, which are a newer treatment. I say sub-Q because they are subcutaneous. The factor infusions have to go into a vein, and the sub-Q medication is an injection, but it can happen just like in your arm. It doesn't need to go into a vein, so you're not infusing something into your veins. There are other treatments for milder forms of hemophilia and VWD, and these include pills or nasal sprays and various other treatments. One thing that everybody with an inherited bleeding disorder should avoid is NSAIDs. If we think about why this is, an NSAID is a blood thinner. And so if we're experiencing bleeding in the joints, or if we're prone to bleeding in any way, we want to avoid anything that would extend the bleed, especially since we're having trouble clotting. So finally, I want to move on to some case examples. We'll start with a prenatal consult. Again, this is an interactive presentation, so I'm hoping that you can contribute to what you think the genetic counseling plan might include. I'll read the scenario. A 30-year-old pregnant woman named Angela comes in for a prenatal genetic counseling appointment at 15 weeks. She was referred for genetic counseling after telling her midwife that she has a brother with hemophilia A. This is her first pregnancy. Her partner is 31 years old and is reportedly healthy. Any idea what we might talk about with this patient? If not, that's okay. I'm training to be a genetic counselor, so I know. The plan will include asking the patient why she's coming in, trying to get a sense of what she already knows about hemophilia, trying to get a sense of how she's feeling about it in relation to her pregnancy. Then we would ask about her pregnancy history and her medical history, trying to discover if there's anything else we should know about her before we proceed. And we would also discuss the benefits and limitations of testing options, and help her in a shared decision-making process. And every appointment, typically, we take a family history. So here is that visual representation of the family tree that I mentioned in the beginning, called a pedigree. And you can see Angela right here is the patient coming in for the appointment today. Here's her partner, who's 31, like was mentioned, and here's the pregnancy at 15 weeks. We can see Angela's brother right here is affected with hemophilia A, and it comes out when we're talking about the family history that the partner's side has some breast cancer. So when we're thinking about genetic counseling appointments, you are there for a certain indication. However, genetic counselors are trained to do any different kind of genetic counseling. So a prenatal genetic counselor, who is the person that she would be seeing for this appointment, still knows a little bit about cancer and can provide genetic counseling or pass off to a cancer genetic counseling colleague if that person doesn't feel capable. However, this would be a flag for any genetic counselor, hopefully, to see a 35-year-old with breast cancer. So anybody who's having cancer, especially breast cancer under 50, is kind of a flag that might be genetic in a genetic counselor's mind, and we would want to offer that person testing. So another thing to think about here is the inheritance pattern of hemophilia. If we know Angela's brother is affected, and we're assuming he has an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, what does that mean about the rest of her family? Does anybody know what this might imply for Angela or for her other family members? Because when we're thinking about genetic counseling, we are there for the patient, we are counseling for the patient. However, genetics is kind of a family affair, so it may spill into advice for other family members.
So I'll help you with the chat.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, of course. So we have a couple of answers that are coming through that they may be carriers, 25%. She has a 50% chance of being a carrier. So definitely the carrier question or comment is coming up here.
Good, you've learned something. That's great. So since we're assuming an X and a Y here, that means the X is affected. And if he got a Y from dad, he got his X from mom, which makes mom an obligate carrier. So there's a 50% chance that Angela herself is a carrier, and then a 50% chance that if she's a carrier, she passes it on to the pregnancy. So the GC will definitely want to talk about hemophilia with Angela. That's the reason she came in. She's probably got a lot of questions about it. We would talk about the risk for the pregnancy and the statistics that we just went over. I would also want to explain the inheritance pattern of hemophilia. I think it's important for the person who's potentially getting a diagnosis or has this running through their family to be able to explain in simple terms what's happening and why it's happening. So we would want to make sure that Angela leaves with a good understanding of the inheritance pattern here, aka how would this be related to her if it's happening to her brother. We would also want to talk about the risks for carriers. So this is where some of these, we might see a phenotype for carriers. So carriers of hemophilia could have potential delivery complications, such as bleeding postpartum or high levels of factor falling shortly. So a possibility for a lack of factor VIII after delivery. During pregnancy, factor VIII, like many other hormones, increases in the system. And so postpartum, you can see implications because of that drop. We would also want to address this breast cancer in the partner's family. It's not why she came in, but we do have an obligation to talk about anything that we do find in the family history that may flag for a genetic condition. We would ask if anybody had had genetic testing for hereditary cancer genes, and we would let Angela know that her partner qualifies for genetic testing. We would recommend a referral to cancer genetics for Angela's partner and Angela's partner's sister, but that may not be the first thing on their mind right now, which is okay. We would talk her through her testing options. So for herself, we may recommend carrier testing, which I mentioned earlier. This is genetic testing that we offer to any and all patients that are interested, basically. So typically we say you can get this as early as preconception, but you can also get it during your pregnancy to understand if you have a risk of being a carrier. We test for all these conditions. You can get different size panels, so you may test for fewer genetic conditions, or you may test for hundreds of genetic conditions. It's up to the patient. With this genetic testing, we're looking specifically at the F8 gene because she is at risk for being a carrier for hemophilia A. It's possible to look at factor VIII clotting activity in people that are affected, but this is actually not a reliable predictor of carrier status. So for carriers, their clotting activity would not be the test that we run. We would want to run genetic testing. This information could be helpful for this pregnancy and for future pregnancies. If she's interested in knowing the status of the pregnancy, if she's a carrier, we could discuss diagnostic testing, which would be an amniocentesis, where a needle is inserted into the belly and we take out some amniotic fluid, which has genetic material that we can test to know the status of the pregnancy. We could also discuss other screen testing options. We're getting a little bit better as a field at trying to estimate what's going on in a pregnancy based on the little bits of genetic material floating around in the pregnant person's blood. So one of these options is called a quad screen, where we look at different levels of molecules in the pregnant person's blood and try to understand if that is indicating a trend for a genetic condition. In every appointment, we always want to address questions and concerns as they come up. So if Angela has any questions, we would be sure to answer them before the appointment's over and during the appointment. We would ultimately be helping with decision making by giving her information to empower her to make this decision, whether to get testing or to not get testing. We would also help her plan for next steps. So we're not ordering testing and then leaving the patient. It's a continuation of care where we guide them through whatever decision they make. For example, 2, we're also going to do a prenatal consult, but this time a 36-year-old pregnant woman named Amira comes in for a prenatal genetic counseling appointment at 12 weeks. She was referred for genetic counseling due to age-related risk. So we see anybody in a prenatal consult who's over the age of 35. This is her second pregnancy, and her partner is 35 years old and is reportedly healthy. Very similar to before, the genetic counseling and plan includes asking the patient why she came in, asking her about her pregnancy history and her medical history. And during this time, the patient can talk about anything that's happened in their past from birth to now. So Amira shares that she has VWD. We may not have been prepared for this in our prep for this consult. However, we're ready because we're bleeding disorder genetic counselors in this scenario. Here we also will discuss benefits and limitations of testing and take a family history. When we're taking a family history, this is what we see. So we see Amira, who shares that she's affected. We see that Amira has a child who's 3 years old and that her partner is 35, and that we aren't seeing any genetic conditions on the partner's side. However, Amira's dad also has VWD. So, what do you think the GC will want to talk about with Amira?
I'll read those answers as they come in. There are several questions that we will get to at
Several
the
questions.
end. So
Okay.
please keep putting those questions inside of the chat here.
So it'll be very similar to the last one since we're still talking about an inherited bleeding disorder. However, we know that this patient is affected. So we're talking about von Willebrand disease. We're talking about the recurrence risk for the pregnancy, and to do this accurately, we need to know what type of VWD she has, because we know that the different types of VWD have different inheritance patterns. So if she knows the type of VWD, then we would be able to give her an accurate risk assessment. Without that, we can give her our best guess, with the caveat that without knowing the type of VWD, we can't accurately estimate that. We would also want to check that her OB knows that she has VWD. Since this didn't seem to be in her medical record, we didn't know this before the appointment. We want to make sure that other doctors are informed so that they can provide the best care. Since we know that she has VWD, we can test her VWF and factor VIII levels. Since she is affected, isn't a carrier, this is an okay test to do for her. For testing options for the pregnancy, we can't do diagnostic testing unless we know the variant that Amira has. So we would need to know that prior to offering diagnostic testing. But at this point in the pregnancy, if the variant is known and we just don't have that documentation, then we could offer a CVS, which is a sample that we take of the placenta, or we could offer that amniocentesis, a sample of the amniotic fluid. Because she came in for her age-related risk, we would offer her aneuploidy screening. Aneuploidy is a word that talks about different numbers of chromosomes than having 23 pairs. So if we're thinking about aneuploidy conditions, pretty much the most common one that comes to mind is Down syndrome, where you have 3 sets of chromosome 21 as opposed to 2 sets. This aneuploidy screening is called cell-free DNA, where they take a sample of the pregnant person's blood and we can see bits and pieces of genetic material that have been fragmented but that exist in the pregnant person's blood that actually represent the chromosomes of the pregnancy. This is also called non-invasive prenatal screening. So finally, I wanted to do a preconception consult example. Here, a 28-year-old man named Omar has hemophilia B. His partner Gina is 31 and is reportedly healthy. The couple would like to start a family and are referred to genetic counseling. The couple comes to the consult together. So this is the same plan that I've presented before. Nothing interesting or of note comes up in the pregnancy history or the medical history. And here is their family history. We find out that Omar is affected with hemophilia B, which we already knew coming in. And we also find out that his mother is a carrier, which makes sense because if he got his X from mom and he's affected with an X-linked recessive condition, that makes her a carrier. Here we denote this that this is a preconception consult with a diamond and a question mark. It would be a P if there was already an ongoing pregnancy happening. So the genetic counselor will talk with Omar and Gina about hemophilia B. We'll talk about the risk for future pregnancies. So since Omar has hemophilia B, all future daughters will be carriers if he passes on his X chromosome to them. Future grandchildren could be affected with hemophilia B, but this is a problem for a later time. All future sons of Omar will be unaffected because he's passing on his Y to the sons. We would talk all of this through, and meanwhile, I would be explaining what I'm saying to you about the X chromosome and the Y chromosome and why it would matter which one got passed on to see somebody affected or not affected. I say all future sons will be unaffected because hemophilia B has a low de novo or spontaneous variation rate. We would talk about also, even though this is a preconception setting, we would talk about screening options that are available to the couple during the pregnancy. We would discuss general screening available, like the first and second trimester ultrasounds, which are quite routine. We would also talk about that aneuploidy screening that I just mentioned, where we're looking at a sample from the pregnant patient's blood. And we would offer them carrier screening right now. They can do it as soon as preconception, like I said. So what if this is flipped? What if Gina is a carrier and Omar is unaffected? How does that change our risk assessment? It doesn't change our plan, but here's the new pedigree. Does anybody have ideas about how this changes when Gina is affected instead of Omar?
I see all the brains thinking here, the smoke coming from the screen.
So again, we're thinking about those sex chromosomes.
There's a comment that Gina could pass it on as a carrier.
Gina could pass it on. Nice job. So we'll talk through that. Here we're still talking about hemophilia B, but now we have a different risk calculation for a future pregnancy. In a future pregnancy, if Gina is affected, there's a 50% chance that Gina passes on the mutation to all future children, right? She has one affected X with a variant and one unaffected X with no variant. In this case, if she passes the affected X on to somebody that does not have a backup, they would be fully affected. And if she passes it on to somebody that does have a backup X, then they would be a carrier. It's also a 50% chance that she doesn't pass it on. In every pregnancy, there's a new 50% chance, just to be clear. It's not like if she has one, then she won't have another. I would also be talking about the inheritance pattern of hemophilia B, which is an X-linked recessive condition, and we would discuss other family members. Like I said, genetics is a family affair. We wind up talking about a risk assessment for pretty much all of the immediate family members when we're talking to somebody that's affected with a condition. We would also be talking about potential delivery complication risks for carriers. Like I mentioned earlier, we could be concerned about a postpartum bleed. So options for their pregnancy. There are lots of different options here. They could achieve pregnancy naturally or by IVF and wait and see if the baby has hemophilia B when they're born. They could achieve pregnancy naturally or by IVF and do diagnostic prenatal genetic testing during the pregnancy to see if they're affected. Or they could use pre-implantation genetic testing to test embryos to see if they're affected. So in this scenario, they're using IVF, and during IVF, there's a time where testing can happen to the embryos at a very early stage, where they take one cell from the embryo and test to see the genetic material for that cell. And in that way, we can kind of understand if the variant is present in that cell, and therefore we can assume in that embryo. In IVF, I'd just like to point out that I mention all of these as options. However, IVF is very expensive. The specific mutation must be known, so this would mean Gina has to get genetic testing for us to be able to offer pre-implantation genetic testing, and it takes time. So if this is something they wanted to start right now, IVF might not be the best option for them. So in summary, genetic counselors meet with individuals who have bleeding disorders or a family history of a bleeding disorder all the time. Genetic counselors can provide risk assessments for family members in future pregnancies, information about testing, and support to families. If you're interested in finding a genetic counselor, there's a link to this website, and I will drop it in the chat when it's time for questions, which is right now. So thank you all for listening to this presentation, and I'm happy to answer those questions in the chat. I'll stop sharing so that it's just my face.
Fantastic, Julia. Well, again, a big round of applause. Thank you for the amount of work that you put into this. I always learn something listening to these. And let me ask you a question before we start with the questions in the chat. How much about bleeding disorders did you know before you started the internship with Neha and did this presentation?
Very little. I mean, I clearly was taught this in my classes, but bleeding disorders was one lecture, so I did my best to know everything. However, this experience with Neha has been really eye-opening, and I feel like the depth of knowledge that I've gained about bleeding disorders is awesome. I'm so excited that I now have this skill.
So, well, I consider you an expert. I have no authority to give you a degree or anything in this, but
Thank you.
you have totally excelled in a short amount of time learning about all things bleeding disorder. So I'm going to go through the questions in the chat and just start with the earliest one.
Great.
How is a genetic counselor typically added to a medical term? Does it usually get referred by the primary physician, asked for by patients? And is there a time when the genetic counselor is the primary physician?
Sure. So let's just clarify really quickly. Genetic counselors are not doctors. They are healthcare professionals, but they're not doctors. So they are considered healthcare providers, but that word can sometimes mean doctor. I just want to clarify. So genetic counselors get added to the team kind of as needed. So if somebody, there are a set of kind of reasons that you would see a genetic counselor that doctors are aware of, and they would make a referral to genetic counseling. So if they see breast cancer before 50 in your family, that might be a referral to a cancer genetic counselor. Or if your OB sees that you're over 35, that might be a referral to a prenatal genetic counselor. I hope that answers the question.
Fantastic, thank you. Another question that came in, does insurance usually cover genetic counseling fees?
Sure. So like I mentioned, there are these this like set of indications, and it depends on the insurance always. And it also depends on what you're hoping to get ordered with your genetic counselor. But typically insurance does cover genetic counseling. And genetic testing is a little bit more, I guess, I don't want to say iffy, but I guess it depends like anything else. If it's indicated, then you can usually get insurance to cover it.
Great, thank you. This was a question when you were going through when the 30% of mutations is spontaneous. So if 30% of mutations are spontaneous, then the error in replication seems pretty common. How does this compare to other genetic disorders?
Sure. So in my knowledge, 30% is pretty high. So this is kind of surprising when we think about why is this happening? Why is this error happening for these specific genes? That's an answer that I'm not sure the scientific community knows, but I could look into it. From my training, that seems high, but it's not unheard of. There are other conditions where all of the time it's a spontaneous mutation. So genetics, when it's replicating at such a fast rate like that, if you think about that you're made up of billions of cells and that you start from one, it's possible to make errors like that.
Great. Comment, accolade, love the metaphors and smiles to help explain. Example, Pac-Man chapters of a book. So kudos, that is always helpful there. A question that also came in, do genetic counselors discuss how women are now diagnosed with hemophilia and why this has changed?
Yeah, so there's actually a section on Neha's website if you're interested in checking it out about women and bleeding disorders. It used to be thought that women couldn't have hemophilia. However, this is not the case anymore, and this kind of goes along with our new understanding about inheritance. And genetic counselors should be discussing this topic with anybody that comes in to talk about a bleeding disorder. So that's why anytime I gave a case example, I laid out that we would be explaining the inheritance pattern, which includes an explanation of why women can show symptoms of hemophilia.
Great answer there, Julia. Does genetic counseling change if the sex of the fetus is known?
So it can. It all depends mostly on what the patient is interested in knowing and what the patient hopes to do with that information. Some patients like the information to be able to prepare prior to a birth for what that may be like. And then some patients would rather not know. So it's important for the genetic counselor to provide all of the information they have about conditions so that the patient can lead the decision-making process and the genetic counselor can just kind of link arms with them through the process.
Awesome. And then the most important question of the evening, and Debbie, I also asked this question. Julia, your earrings, spot on. Tell us all about your fantastic earrings.
Thank you so much. I am a science nerd and my sister knows it, and that is where my earrings came from. She got them for me off of Etsy. I think you could Google like DNA earrings and this is what comes up. So thank you for noticing.
Yeah, we may have to find those and raffle them off at one of our silent auctions because they're very cool.
Thank
They
you.
are very cool. Well, I think those are all the questions that we had in the chat. If anyone else has any questions, you can unmute yourself or put it in the chat there. We'll just give it another second or so. Again, a lot of accolades and great presentations. And to echo that, thank you, Julia, for putting this together. We'll just wait another couple of seconds for questions. And as we do that, I'll just give a shout out that this, since it is being recorded, it will be on our YouTube channel shortly. So if you're watching this, that means it's on the YouTube channel already. You are viewing it from your own home at some point. But again, thank you, Julia, for the amount of time that you put in and have given to NEHA over the past couple of weeks. We're excited to help you as you transition on after NEHA into a very promising career for your future. So thank you very much for all that you have done.
Of course. Thank you. It's been wonderful. I love NEHA.
Well, once it's like Pringles, once you start, you can't stop. So now you're a part of us for life here. We do
Awesome.
not do branding of any way or hazing, but I promise you, you are part of this Wicked Strong family indefinitely. I just want to give a shout out that we also have several events that are coming up as well. So this weekend starts our Fall Fest meeting up in Conway, New Hampshire. There's a 3-part series to this. Next Wednesday, a week from today, is our annual presentation and our Meet the Board webinar combined into one at 7 o'clock. And then we have our live interactive sessions that Julia will be helping with us on Saturday, the 23rd of October. Following that, we have a couple of other webinars that are also coming up and 2 more in-person events. So we're really excited to have these in-person events after a year and a half of being virtual. Our women's retreat, which is in November, and then our holiday party, which is coming up in December. So I will put the link in the chat for anyone that is interested. You can always find the most up-to-date information on our website by just clicking the event page there. So with that said, again, Julia, thank you for all your information tonight. And for anyone else, and for everyone that is joining us, thank you for being part of this. So have a great night. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you.